Snow had fallen early that year, soft and deceptive, like a promise that meant to break. It blanketed the Callahan place in white silence, the old fence half buried, the windmill frozen stiff, the little cabin huddled beneath the gray sky as if ashamed of its own smallness. May Callahan stood by the window, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, watching the pale horizon dissolve into dusk. Out there was nothing but wind and snow and the endless ache of distance. Since her father's death, she'd spoken to no one but the chickens and the winter wind. There had been suitors once, farmhands, traders, men who'd looked at her the way lonely men look at anything that might fill the quiet, but she'd turned them all away. They wanted someone grateful, someone who'd depend on them. May had learned dependence was just another word for dying slow. The kettle whistled on the stove, steam curling through the cold air. She poured herself a thin cup of coffee and sat by the fire. Outside, the world was swallowed by the snow, and the sound of it, that soft, steady whisper, felt almost holy. She thought of her father then, how he used to hum while carving wood, how he'd say, "The land don't owe us warmth, May girl. We owe it patience." The creak of saddle leather cut through the wind. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the kind of sound loneliness makes when it's been too long without another voice. But then she heard it again, the muffled grunt of a horse fighting through snow, hooves striking hard ice. She rose, setting her cup aside, and peered through the window. Out of the gray dusk came a rider, a tall figure slumped in the saddle, hat pulled low, a smaller bundle cradled in front of him. The horse staggered, steam rising from its flanks. May's heart stumbled with it. By the time she stepped onto the porch, the rider was nearly at her gate. He lifted his head, face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. The smaller figure stirred, a child, wrapped in his coat, her small hands clinging to the reins as though they were her father's arms. "We need a place for the night," the man said. His voice was rough, the sound of gravel dragged over old wood. "Just till the storm passes," May hesitated. The world was wide and cruel. Strangers brought trouble more often than peace, but the girl's lips were blue, her little face pale as paper. "Bring her in," May said at last. "And the horse can stay in the shed." The man nodded once, grateful, though pride kept him from showing it. He lifted the child gently, setting her on the porch, before leading the weary horse toward shelter. May opened the door, guiding the girl inside. The warmth hit them like a sigh. "What's your name, sweetheart?" May asked, kneeling to help remove the child's soaked boots. "Ellie," the girl whispered, voice trembling. "And your father?" "Luke," came the quiet reply from the doorway. The man had returned, snow melting on his coat, hat still low over his face. "Luke Harren." May nodded toward the chair by the fire. "Sit, I'll get you coffee." He didn't move right away, only studied her, eyes dark and unreadable beneath the brim. Then he set his hat aside, revealing a face weathered by sun and years of work, the kind of face that had seen more graves than dances. His hair was streaked with gray, his jaw marked with stubble, and there was a faint scar cutting through one eyebrow. "You don't owe us that," he said. "Maybe not," May answered, pouring the weak coffee into tin cups. "But I'd hate myself if I didn't." Ellie curled up near the hearth, thawing her fingers by the fire. Her small boots steamed. She smiled at May with the shy warmth only children carry, the kind that breaks something soft inside a lonely person. Luke took the cup, nodded once and drank without another word. They ate what little there was, cornmeal, a scrap of jerky, and the last jar of pickled beans. It wasn't much, but it felt like enough. The wind outside moaned against the cabin, rattling the shutters. Inside, silence grew between them, heavy, uncertain, but not unfriendly. "You from town?" May asked at last. "Farther," Luke replied. "You headed there?" "Maybe." He said it like a man who no longer trusted destinations. May studied him in the flickering light. His hands were large, calloused, but with an old burn scar along the wrist, a mark that told of fire and work and pain endured without complaint. When he reached to stoke the fire, she caught a glimpse of a small silver locket hanging from a leather cord around his neck. It was worn smooth, The kind of thing a man touches when memory gets too loud. Ellie dozed by the fire. Luke laid his coat over her shoulders before sitting back. "Where's your husband?" he asked quietly. May looked at the flames. "Buried on this land. Along with most everything else that mattered." He didn't press her, just nodded, like one soul recognizing the ruin of another. The night deepened. The wind outside slowed to a low hum. Luke's horse stamped in the shed. The kettle hissed again. May poured herself another cup, then poured him one too. "You'll freeze by morning if you ride out now," she said. He met her gaze. "Didn't plan to. Just needed to make sure we weren't unwelcome." "You ain't," she said, surprising herself with how quickly the words came. He nodded once, slow, and the quiet settled back between them, a fragile peace warmed by coffee, firelight, and exhaustion. When Ellie stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about her mother, May looked at the man again. His jaw tightened, his eyes softened. Whatever story he carried, it was heavy enough to sink a stronger man. Later, when she lay in her narrow bed, May listened to the soft rhythm of the fire and the distant creak of floorboards where Luke slept. The sound should have been unsettling, but it wasn't. It felt steady, real. She thought of the coins he'd tried to press into her hand earlier, silver dull from travel. She had refused, not out of pride, but because taking them would have made the act smaller somehow. Kindness, she told herself, wasn't meant to be bought. Before sleep took her, she glanced once more at the fire, the way it fought the cold, stubborn and alive. In that flickering light, she felt something shift quietly inside her. Morning came pale and still, the kind of light that softened the edges of everything, but couldn't quite reach the corners of May Callahan's cabin. Frost traced silver vines across the window panes. The fire had burned low, but the faint warmth of it still lingered, the ghost of the night before. When May stepped outside, the world smelled of snow and pine and old wood. The horizon stretched unbroken, gray fields under a sky that looked too big for any one soul to fill. Her boots crunched in the frost as she crossed to the chicken coop, scattering feed with slow, practiced motions. The birds clucked and fussed, little clouds of breath puffing in the cold. Behind her, a low creak broke the stillness. She turned and saw Luke Harren at the fence line, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hammering a post back into place. The sound of metal striking wood echoed through the empty yard, steady, purposeful. He hadn't asked. He'd simply found the tools where her father had left them and set to work. "Don't need to do that," she called out. Luke didn't look up. "A fence like this won't stand another storm." It stood just fine without help. "Doesn't mean it should." His tone was quiet. Not sharp, but final. A man used to fixing what was broken whether he was asked or not. May hesitated, then turned back to her chores. Still, the sound of his work followed her. The rhythmic thud of a hammer. The scrape of boots against frozen earth. Ellie sat near the coop, tossing crumbs into the snow, giggling when the hens pecked around her boots. It was a sound May hadn't heard in a long time. Laughter. It startled her with its brightness. The child's cheeks were pink from the cold, her eyes clear and trusting. May caught herself smiling before she meant to. "Your papa works fast," she said, handing Ellie a small handful of grain. "He says fences keep the world honest," the girl answered, scattering the feed. "He says mending one is better than fighting men who break 'em." May paused, watching Luke from a distance. His movements were clean, deliberate, the mark of someone who'd worked hard for too long to waste effort. The burn scar on his wrist caught the morning light, thin and pale against weathered skin. It reminded her of her father's forge, the hiss of iron in water, the smell of smoke and sweat. Every man carried the story of his fire somewhere. When the fence was done, Luke straightened, breath visible in the cold air. He nodded toward the barn. "You got oil for that hinge?" "Door's about to come off its frame," she frowned. "You make a habit of fixing folks' places uninvited?" He gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Just can't abide something that's halfway broke." May studied him a moment longer. He wasn't the kind of man who filled silence with talk. Everything about him, his quiet, his steady gaze, his measured movements, spoke of someone who'd learned patience the hard way. Inside, she set water to boil for coffee. The smell filled the small cabin, bitter and comforting. Luke came in a moment later, wiping his hands on his coat, Ellie close behind. "You always been out here alone?" he asked. May hesitated. "Not always. Family." "A brother," she said, the lie slipping too easily. "He's gone to work the rail lines. Might be back come spring." Luke nodded slowly, as though the words made sense, though she knew they didn't. There was something in his eyes, a recognition, maybe, that told her he saw through it. The truth was harder. Her brother Thomas had left 2 years ago, chasing wages and whiskey both. No letters, no footprints. Just gone, like the rest. Luke's gaze drifted to the mantel, where an old photograph stood in a cracked frame, her father and a younger version of herself, both squinting against sunlight. He studied it for a long while, then said quietly, "He was a rancher." "Was," May replied. Luke nodded again, his expression unreadable. "Good man by the look of him." "He was," she said softly. "Too proud for his own good. Thought the land would love him back if he worked it hard enough." There was a pause. "The kettle began to hum, did it?" Luke asked. May looked out the window at the pale field stretching beyond the fence. Not in time, they drank their coffee in silence. Ellie hummed to herself by the fire, playing with the corner of a faded shawl May had given her. The girl had an easy sweetness about her, unscarred by the world's sharp edges. Not yet. Around midday, a wagon rolled by on the far road. May went to the door, curious. A pair of men sat up front, wrapped in heavy coats, their voices carrying faintly across the still air. "Sheriff says he's still out there. Rich cattleman, gone missing near the border. Some say he stole from his own partners before he vanished. Or they framed him," the other man said. "Either way, bounties posted in town. $1,000 if you find him alive." May's stomach tightened. She glanced over her shoulder. Luke stood by the window, jaw set, eyes fixed on the distant wagon until it disappeared over the rise. His expression didn't change, but something in the air did. A heaviness that pressed against the walls of the cabin. "Sounds like they're after someone," May said quietly. Luke turned away from the window. "Men like that are always after someone." She studied him, the scar, the worn coat, the steady hands. He didn't look like a thief, but he did look like someone who'd been accused of things he didn't do. She knew that look well enough. The world never needed proof to punish the poor or the quiet. "Should I be worried?" she asked finally. Luke met her gaze. "Not unless you plan to start listening to gossip." He said it without threat, but the words carried weight. Ellie looked up, sensing the tension though she didn't understand it. "Papa, are we bad people?" Luke knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "No, darling. Just folks trying to get somewhere better." May turned back to the fire, her chest tight. She'd spent most of her life trying to believe the same thing. That goodness wasn't about where you came from, or what you'd lost, but what you kept trying to hold on to. As the afternoon light faded, Luke went back outside, repairing the barn door just as he'd promised. May watched from the window, her hands resting on the sill. He worked until sunset, until the snow began again, light and slow, drifting across the field like ash from a faraway fire. She realized then that whatever he was running from, it wasn't the law. It was grief, the kind that leaves a man mending fences not because he hopes to stay, but because fixing things is the only way he knows to keep from falling apart. And for the first time in years, May felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared name, the quiet recognition of another lost soul who might understand hers. The storm came without warning. By sundown, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel, the kind that promised no mercy. Wind moved through the prairie like a living thing, bending the scrub and rattling the old windmill until it cried out like a dying creature. May Callahan stood at the door of her cabin, watching the clouds roll low and thick, the air charged with that sharp scent that always came before rain. Luke was out by the shed, securing the horse. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the practiced calm of a man who'd fought storms before, not just in weather, but in life. Ellie sat on the floor inside, wrapping her arms around the family dog that wasn't there anymore. Just an old rug she pretended could still breathe. The girl's laughter had faded into a quiet hum, a tune she must have learned from her mother. When the first crack of thunder split the air, Luke led the horse inside the shed and slammed the door against the wind. By the time he reached the porch, rain had begun to fall. Thick, cold drops that stung his face and plastered his shirt to his chest. "Looks like it's going to be a hard one," May called, pulling the door wide enough for him to slip through. He shook the rain from his coat and nodded. "Hardest I've seen this far north." As if to prove him right, lightning flared across the horizon, a bright white wound opening in the dark. The thunder followed close behind, deep and hollow, rolling through the hills. The cabin shuddered under it, boards creaking like bones. May threw another log on the fire, sparks leaping in protest. The warmth spilled across the room, catching on the old kettle, the tin plates, the line of wet boots drying near the wall. Luke crouched by the fire, rubbing his hands together. His palms were scarred and strong, a map of every fight he'd survived. Ellie crawled close to him, her small body trembling. "Will it take the roof, Papa?" "Not if we listen close," he said softly. "Storms don't like being ignored." That earned a faint smile from May. "Is that how you beat 'em? By paying respect?" He met her eyes. "You don't beat a storm, ma'am. You outlast it." For a time, the wind filled the space where words might have been. It clawed at the shutters, roared through the chimney, and pushed against the door like something hungry. May poured coffee into 3 cups, thin and bitter, the way her father had made it on nights just like this. Luke thanked her with a nod. When he lifted the cup, his hand shook slightly. Not from fear, she thought, but from exhaustion. There was something in his eyes tonight, something unguarded. The man who'd worked her fences by morning now looked stripped bare, as if the storm had peeled away whatever armor he'd worn. "You from cattle country?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. He glanced toward the window where lightning flashed white across his face. "Was down near the Pecos, dry land." "Hard land. Hard men, too, I reckon." He gave a small nod. "Harder than they needed to be. I had a spread once, 3 hands, 60 head. Thought that meant something back then." "What happened?" Luke stared into the fire, his expression tightening. "Drought came. Then came men with more money than conscience. They offered to buy. I refused, so they took." He spoke the last words with no anger, only a tired certainty. "They burned what they couldn't steal," he went on. "Cattle, barns, even the cottonwoods where we used to hang the wash. My wife," he stopped, jaw clenching. "She tried to save a colt. Fire took her with it. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Even the wind seemed to falter. May didn't look away. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Luke nodded once, eyes fixed on the flames. "That was 3 winters ago. Been drifting since. A man can outrun a lot of things, but not what's buried." She understood that better than she wanted to admit. She thought of her father's grave out by the willows, the way she'd left wildflowers on it every spring, though no one came to see. She thought of the brother who'd left and never wrote, and of the letters she'd never had the courage to send. "I used to think of leaving too," she said after a while. "Heading east, maybe. Find a school or a seamstress shop. But every time I packed, something stopped me. Guess I got too used to the land, or too scared of what I'd find if I went. Or what you'd lose," Luke said. She looked at him, startled by how plainly he'd said it, as if he'd read her thoughts. The wind howled again, shaking the window pane. Ellie whimpered, and Luke lifted her onto his knee. "It's just noise, sweetheart," he murmured. "Just the sky talking too loud." The girl buried her face in his chest. May watched the way he held her. Gentle, protective, the kind of tenderness that comes only from loss. She hadn't seen a man hold something that way in years. Thunder rolled again, closed this time. The room flashed white, and for a moment, Luke's eyes met hers across the firelight. In them she saw not danger, not mystery, but a hollow ache that matched her own. "You ever wonder," she said quietly, "why some folks get second chances and others don't?" Luke's voice was low, almost lost under the storm. "I figure no one gets a real second chance." Just new storms to weather, May smiled faintly, and maybe new roofs to build. He returned the smile, small, uncertain, but real. The night deepened, the rain steady as a heartbeat. May sat back in her chair, shawl wrapped around her, watching the flames dance across the walls. She noticed Luke's locket again, the small silver one hanging from that leather cord. When the firelight touched it, she could just make out a faded engraving. 2 initials and a tiny etched flower. Was that hers? She asked gently. He nodded, touching it once. Ellie's mother. She used to say storms were just the Earth's way of reminding us how small we are. May looked toward the roof, where rain drummed harder now. Then I reckon the Earth's got a sharp tongue tonight. Luke chuckled softly, a sound that surprised both of them. It wasn't joy, exactly, but something close to remembering what it felt like. When Ellie finally fell asleep, curled between them near the hearth, May lowered her voice. You don't have to tell me more, she said. But whatever you're running from, I don't think it's evil that drives you. He met her gaze again, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he didn't look away. Maybe not, he said quietly. But sometimes running's the only way a man remembers he's still alive. Outside, the storm raged and howled, clawing at the windows, throwing its fury against the small cabin that refused to break. Inside, the fire burned steady, golden against the dark. 2 lost souls and a sleeping child at its center, outlasting what could not be fought, holding on to the single fragile warmth that made the world bearable. And in the echo of thunder, May thought that maybe, just maybe, the storm wasn't trying to destroy. The morning after the storm dawned gray and hollow. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke, the kind that lingers after lightning has struck too close. May stepped outside to gather what the wind had spared, a tin bucket, a half-torn sheet from the line, a few feathers scattered in the mud. Inside, Luke was fixing the door hinge that the storm had nearly torn loose. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, the scar on his wrist catching the dull light. The girl hummed while drying dishes, and for a moment, the cabin felt almost like a home. Then came the sound of hooves. 2 riders from town, hard-eyed men with pistols low on their hips, dismounted in the yard. They said they were looking for a man named Harren, a ranch thief who'd fled after torching a cattle baron's barn. May's stomach twisted. She met Luke's eyes only once, saw the quiet plea there, and turned back to the men with steady hands. No one's been here but me, she said, her voice calm as the frost. The riders looked past her, saw only a child by the fire and a mended fence, and moved on. When they rode off, the sound of their hooves lingered long after they were gone. Inside, May shut the door and faced Luke. Who are you really? She asked. He took off his hat, brushed the rain from it, and said quietly, a man who lost more than he owned. Then, after a long pause, that saddle outside, it's mine. They took it when they burned what was left of my ranch. His words hung heavy between them, like smoke that would not clear. That night, May couldn't sleep. The wind had gone still, yet her thoughts churned like storm water. Below her loft, Luke lay awake too, his breathing slow and rough. She listened, not out of fear, but because that sound, steady and alive, reminded her she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. When she finally closed her eyes, she dreamt of firelight glinting on the barrel of the rifle above the door, a symbol of all that divides survival from sin, mercy from justice. Emotional tone and realization. Tone. Tense, moral, and emotionally charged, the quiet before a reckoning. Realization. May learns that truth and justice are not always the same, and that to protect someone can mean sharing their burden. Symbolism. The rifle above the door, a silent witness to both danger and compassion, drawing the line between trust and betrayal. The night came quiet, but it did not stay that way. May awoke to the crackle of fire, not from her hearth, but from the yard beyond. Through the window, orange light wavered against the black of the plains. She caught her breath and shook Luke awake. Outside, shadows moved, the same men from before, their voices rough with whiskey and hate. Torches in their hands, they shouted accusations into the wind. "Thief! Murderer! Come out, Harren!" Luke rose without a word, his expression carved from stone. He reached for his coat, his revolver, then stopped. "No more running," he said. May felt her heart thud in her chest, that old cold fear returning, the same that had kept her small and silent all her life. But something in Luke's stillness steadied her. She took her father's rifle down from above the door. When Luke opened the door, the storm of firelight met them. The men stood in a half-circle, faces half-lit and cruel. Their horses snorted, restless from the smoke. One of them stepped forward, the one with the scarred cheek, and spat in the dirt. "You stole from the wrong man, Harren. Ain't no widow's kindness gonna save you." May stepped beside Luke. Her voice trembled, but her aim did not. "You'll leave now." A heartbeat of silence stretched thin. Then someone moved. A torch swung, a gun flashed, and the world split with thunder. The recoil slammed May's shoulder. One man fell, the rest bolted, vanishing into the darkness they'd brought with them. Smoke, gunpowder, and the bitter smell of singed earth filled the air. May stood shaking, ears ringing. Luke turned toward her, his coat smoldering where a spark had caught it. Then she realized her shawl was burning, the fabric curling to flame near her shoulder. Before she could react, Luke tore it free, smothering it beneath his coat. The fire died, leaving his palms blistered and raw. Neither spoke. The only sound was Ellie's frightened sob from inside the cabin. Luke knelt by the doorway, head bowed, breath ragged. May sank beside him, wrapping her arms around the child. In that moment, no one was a stranger. They were simply three souls caught in the red aftermath of survival. When dawn came, the prairie was gray with smoke and frost. Together they buried the dead man's horse by the fence line, saying nothing, only working until their hands were numb. Luke's wounds blistered worse in the morning light, yet he made no complaint. May looked at him then, not as a fugitive nor as a guest, but as someone marked by the same kind of loss that had shaped her own. She understood, finally, that courage was never born from strength. It came from love, quiet, wordless, disguised as duty. As they stood beside the small mound of earth, the wind carried the last curl of smoke eastward, where the rising sun began to burn the frost away. Emotional tone and realization, tone, fiery, redemptive and raw. The breaking point. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year. The snows melted into thin rivers that carved paths through the prairie, and the grass rose pale and new where fire had once burned. Weeks passed, measured by the creak of May's porch boards and the hollow echo of an empty cabin. Luke's wounds healed, though the scars on his hands remained like brands of survival. He helped mend the barn roof and split the last of her firewood before the lawmen came. They rode in under a white sky, badges dulled with dust, their faces grave. They asked their questions in the doorway, about the shooting, about the men who'd come to her ranch, about the stranger who'd stayed through the storm. May told them what she could, and nothing more. Luke stood silent beside her, his hat low, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. When the lawmen left, their boots left no sound on the thawing ground. One of them turned back before mounting and said quietly, "World's got its own way of balancing things." Then they were gone. In the days that followed, the truth drifted through the nearby town like smoke over morning fields. Luke Harren was no outlaw. He was the missing cattleman from the southern country, the one who'd vanished after refusing to sell his land to men who built fortunes on deceit. He'd walked away from wealth, from a name that no longer fit, carrying only his daughter and a grief too heavy to leave behind. When Luke told May this, she did not look at him with surprise, only with the kind of calm that comes from seeing a thing one already knew in her bones. "You're still the same man who fixed my fence," she said. "Money doesn't change the truth of someone's hands." He smiled at that, a quiet, broken smile, and placed a folded paper on her table. A deed. a parcel of land in his name, offered freely as repayment for what she'd done. "I don't need your land, Luke," she said, voice trembling. "What I did wasn't for sale." He nodded once, slowly. "I know, but maybe it's a way to start again." May reached across the table, covering the deed with her hand. "I already have." The silence that followed was long and tender. Ellie ran her fingers across the windowsill, tracing the light as it fell in soft bars through the glass. The sound of distant birds drifted in, a promise that spring was coming. When Luke finally saddled his horse, May stood by the gate, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. Ellie turned in the saddle, waving with both hands. Luke said only, "Thank you." His voice carried the weight of everything left unspoken. May watched them ride until they were two dark shapes against the pale horizon. The wind moved through the grass, whispering like a heartbeat through the empty land. She returned to the cabin, lit the lamp, and sat in the rocking chair that had once been her father's. The room felt both smaller and fuller than before, filled with something quiet and living. Days passed, marked by chores and silence. But when spring came for certain, she found new footprints by the creek, deep, fresh, and familiar. A folded note lay beneath her door, the paper curled from dew. It read, "Home isn't a place. It's a person who stayed when you needed her most." May read it twice, then tucked it beneath the lamp, her heart steady and strange in her chest. Outside, the grass shimmered green over the graves by the fence line, where even loss seemed to be growing something new. The wind carried the scent of rain, clean, forgiving. And as she looked